The Process Podcast, breaking down the daily habits, processes, and tools of high achievers. Now, here's your host, Brad Wilson.
Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Process Podcast. I'm your host, Brad Wilson. Do you think of yourself as a maximizer, the type of human being who wants to squeeze every single ounce of joy, productivity, and love out of your life? Or maybe you find yourself stuck in a rut in some aspect of your personal or professional life, and you'd like to hear weekly wisdom from Olympic gold medalists, worldwide best-selling authors, renowned psychotherapists, and much more. If so, take a second and subscribe to the show, because if my guests make as large of an impact on your life as they have on mine, you'll be using and incorporating their wisdom on a daily basis. Speaking of dropping bombs of wisdom, today's guest is the author of the book, How to End the Stories That Screw Up Your Life, Ernest Svendsen. In our brains, we tell many, often contradictory stories about who it is that we are. Many of these stories cause us anxiety, anger, frustration, jealousy, and a host of other negative feelings. But what if they're not really true? And what if there were an actionable system that allowed us to turn those stories into dust so that we could dramatically reduce our own internal suffering? Good news. There is. It's called The Work of Byron Katie. It's freely available on the interwebs at thework.com/en/do-work. Also available on my show page at mentallyinvincible.com, and it's at the core of Ernest's book. In our conversation, we discuss the only capital T truth that Ernest has found in the world, why vulnerability is often the strongest position we can take, the process and benefits of regular self-inquiry, and much more. So before without any further ado-us, I just want to take a moment to mention how special this interview was to me. In our talk, Ernest told me that he regularly finds himself feeling love for strangers that he meets in his day-to-day life at coffee shops, restaurants, etc. And I can say that without a doubt, despite the fact that Ernest and I were thousands of miles away from one another and communicating through a computer screen and microphone, I could tangibly feel Ernest's immense love, which to me was powerful and memorable, and it's my sincerest hope that you feel it too, because a little more love makes the world a much better place. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Ernest Svendsen. Ernest, good morning, my friend. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm very good, thank you. It's afternoon here where I am, and a windy autumn day, and it's very cozy.
I guess it's morning, evening is relative to where we are in the world at the present moment, right?
That's the way it works.
So I want to start this conversation out by asking you about one of the first times that you felt curious about this exploration of the human mind.
As far back as I can remember, I think I've been very interested or curious about how things worked with us. My initial, when I was just a child, and I think the very natural process of children is to have like a religious approach to the universe. There is this big, huge thing, and it just makes sense that there is this God character of some sort. So the very first sort of speculation I can connect to into the matters were of religious nature. I was into like the basic questions like where do we come from and why have God made this world with suffering, and those sort of very naive questions, and that sort of developed more and more into a deep interest of, well, basically also the occult and sort of everything. I was tearing down books from the shelves in the library on every possible topic that had to do with anything out of the ordinary, and my favorite novel topics were fantasy books. I was reading everything I could get my hands on. So I was really into it. And then at some point I came across books on hypnosis. And this was sort of the first time I found something that I can actually try out. It was like, here's a practical thing. It's not just theories or stories. No, this is something to test out. So I began getting into that, and in sort of my late school years in the basic school, whatever it's called.
How old were you?
Well, this was like eighth grade probably. So I was 14, something around that, 13, 14. I had that very interesting experience of being able to hypnotize my friends. The first time was I hypnotized Frederick from my class, so he couldn't get his hands down from his neck as he was standing. And I remember so clearly standing. There was the schoolyard, and there was this door. You could just go out on the other side. You weren't really supposed to go there, but we could find some peace there, and there were a few of the others standing around. And he couldn't get his hands down from his neck. And it was such an amazing experience. Do
you remember how you talked him into participating in the experience?
Oh, no, that part I don't. I think we were just all curious. I don't know why he would do it. He was like this, he wasn't very philosophical or into these things. I think we were just a group of boys, and I was probably talking about it with the enthusiasm that I am good at having for things. And I guess it was just the first real, probably not even the first. I have this, I think I could have been a very good, like, seducer of people, like, what do you call it? Like a dictator or something. I have a knack for convincing people. So I guess I just probably convinced him into trying it out, or he got curious or whatever. So I did that, and that was a very strong experience, and that was that. And then there was this girl I was in love with, and I managed to hypnotize her so she couldn't let go of the pipes in the ceiling in my basement, which was also really fascinating. This early sort of awakening sexual time. It was like, wow, this is an amazing thing. So that was where it stepped from being like philosophy and how does the world like hang together, and became this mind. Where does that play in, and what does that do, and how does it work? And I guess that started off like a long journey of going deeper and deeper into understanding the mind. I went to what's called gymnasium here in Denmark, which is like 10th, 11th, 12th grade. And there I met sort of some people one of my teachers did kinesiology, which is like a technique for working with energy and in the body. And I got into that, and I studied that, and it moved into other things, and went on a long deep dive into the whole sort of exploration of everything, including spirituality and
So instead of tearing down the fantasy books and books on the occult, you started tearing down the books about the mind. How did it feel to share the solution to these questions that you ask yourself with other people?
That's such an interesting question. I think it combined, there's so many aspects to it. I have like one of the traits I also have is like I have like an acting skill or a performance, let's call it that, gene in me. So also from very early on, I was always the guy who was, doing the stand-up show or the talk or the presentation or the introduction to the topic or whatever. I did a lot of entertainment and stuff, and also worked professionally like that for a while. And it was like over time, those things merged. So the joy of being on with an audience or with others, and then having a message that was profound, not just something foolish or something for school, but actually having a message that really mattered. Those two things sort of merged into like teaching and training, and the enormous satisfaction of realizing that what I was sharing actually impacted and impacts people's lives.
Do you have an example of how it impacted somebody's life early on?
Well, I started very early to sort of share. Like I went to this was in my university days. I began very early, I became involved in this Center for Philosophy and Learning and Self-Development, and very quickly became like, I don't know what the translation, it was called center leader in the direct translation. But I ran this center, which was a very active center or like a place with many different activities every day. And I then was one of the teachers trainers there. And so I was beginning to give lectures on some of all this stuff that I had collected. And one of the things that sort of happened in my mind was that the practical applicability of knowledge very quickly, and maybe inspired by the whole hypnosis and sort of that process, became an issue. So when I would train or teach, it wouldn't be about, theories about how things worked. It would be applicable things like, how do you solve that? Or when you have this problem, or how does this mechanism of mind work? How does projection work? How does this work? And that sort of clearly began impacting people, in that instead of just getting more knowledge about how the universe worked, and in spiritual circles that can be very high flying, some of the theories about star people and all these different levels and how everything evolves, and it can become very esoteric. But me focusing on sort of the practical aspects of it, like, so what do you do? So for instance, how do you handle your anger, or how do you handle projections, began really having an impact. And so the first really major response, other than I was giving lectures and talks and people came up and were happy and saying thank you, the first really major response was when I published my first book, which I wrote in my late 20s, and which became a bestseller when it came out, and it's called Presence, or Being Present. It's a translation will be coming out in English on Amazon shortly, but it's only in Danish at the moment. And that sort of really impacted, and people started contacting me and saying, "Oh wow, thank you." And I still hear from people who say, reading that book changed the course of my life, or the direction of my life.
Wow.
And that's, of course, then as I've become more and more capable or skillful in my ways of working with people, it's like that's what I do now for a living in individual coaching sessions and group coaching sessions and training sessions. There is an impact, and the response is very powerful, and that's of course super satisfying to have a job that actually does that.
And you mentioned earlier, going back to the process of writing your first book, Presence. You mentioned finding something worthy of people's time, of people's attention, of people's investment of energy. Why the topic of presence?
Yeah. Well, what happened was I was deeply into this whole esoteric, spiritual, philosophical, psychological things, and as I said, it was this huge, vast amount of knowledge, of which much was collected in ways that weren't exactly scientific, like clairvoyant knowledge or wisdom masters speaking, whatever, all these different ways. So
very
there was
abstract.
all this knowledge. Yeah, abstract or and theoretical, and yeah. So at some point, I sort of got really filled with that. I knew everything about anything, and I could, you could ask me about astrological things or reincarnation or, basically every aspect of spiritual, New Age, from tarot to like the meaning of tarot cards to the 7 masters to, you name it. And I was just so full of it. And at one point I just stopped and asked myself, of all this vast knowledge I have, what do I actually know to be true? Like, what do I know for sure is real? And that started a very interesting process of pulling things apart. And where I ended up was the only thing almost I could say with certainty was true and useful was the concept of presence, of being present. The now, right now, is the only reality, and everything else is thought. And I could see that as I sort of looked into the different masters from the different teachers of different religions, be that yogic masters or Buddha or Jesus or whoever, there was a core around that from all of them. This idea of being here now is the solution to things. So as I then said, okay, let me throw out everything I don't know and focus on what I know to be true, and let me start there with the present moment. It just became so clear to me that was the core truth, and everything else was speculation. And so that led to that inquiry that then became the book of being present. And this was back before like mindfulness and before Eckhart Tolle, and before it sort of became a thing. At that time, it was mainly like a Zen Buddhist concept, this focus on presence, and a very Eastern idea from yoga and stuff. So
I have many more questions to ask about presence and identity, who we are. But first, I do want to go back a second, because to me it seems like in a lot of ways your identity was having this knowledge and being able to talk about all of these esoteric things. How did it feel when you did ask yourself the fundamental question of what do I know to be true, and then having to, in some ways, analyze your very identity to remove these things, and then the pursuit of the truth?
Yeah. Well, at that point, it felt like a relief. I think I have a capacity for storing a lot and knowing a lot and holding a lot and seeing a lot of connections, but it's also burdensome in some way to have to, and I would say the problem is also that as a consequence, there were all these moral precepts of right and wrong, right? That comes with knowledge, comes this idea of right and wrong. And so there were all these rules that I more or less consciously felt I had to live up to. I had to be in a certain way. I had to treat other people in a certain way. So there was, while I was doing a lot of spontaneous, like I was doing improvised improv acting, so there was a part of me that was using the spontaneous very much. There was also a filtering or a stiffness of exactly upholding a certain demeanor or a certain way of being in the world. And so letting go of that and suddenly realizing that the present moment is all I have to navigate by, like relieved me of this whole burden of right and wrong and knowing, and opened me up to a whole new avenue of just experiencing what is right now and acting from that. So I would say it was a process of going from an intellectual place as like the center of gravity in me to a more heart presence kind of center of gravity. And that felt like a shedding of a lot of, let's call it luggage, or let's call it garbage, or at least excess weight. So it wasn't threatening or problematic. It really was a relief.
I think it's amazing for people to hear because of the attachment that we feel to all of this weight, trash, garbage, whatever it is that you want to characterize it as.
Yeah. And I think some of it has to do with like, why do you want to know? It wasn't like I wanted to know in order to be that identity, to be wise, to be able to say wise things. I honestly wanted to know and honestly want to know. It's not like, it's like this drive. I just want to know. So in that sense, it's relieving when you realize that, hey, there's something more profound or more true than what you found. So I think that may also be part of it. It's a genuine desire to understand.
Losing that baggage, losing that weight is very freeing, allowed you to pursue a singular thing in presence and write a book on it. In your new book, the first topic, the first thing that is addressed is this sense of self by simply saying, I have a body. My mouth is speaking right now. The fundamental question is, what am I? Who am I? Could you tell me about your exploration into the self and really just an amazing discovery?
Yeah. It's such a tricky and amazing question, this who am I? And yes, I was really looking into that as part of my sort of questioning what's going on, it became relevant, of course. I found that I wasn't my body, that I can't say that was me, because well, through observation basically, but what became clear to me was that my body changes all the time. I mean, if you look at a picture of me now and a picture of me when I was 3 years old, it's very different bodies, and obviously every part of it has been changed many times over in those years. And the sense of me, the sense of self, seems to be there unbroken throughout. So I found that that's not it. That's not who I am, what I understand to be me. And then I discovered it's the same thing with my emotions. They come and go. Like I had so many emotions yesterday that are just completely gone, vanished. And so if I was them, obviously I'd be gone also. So I'm something separate of the body, separate of the emotions. And the same goes for my thoughts. I don't know how many thoughts, and luckily I can't remember most of them. So they also go. And then at some point I discovered that I had this voice in my head, and in my experience and in talking to people, everyone that I've spoken to has a voice that sort of narrates or speaks in their minds, sometimes more actively than other times. And I thought for a while that then was sort of who I was. And it turned out, as I sort of kept looking into that it couldn't be, because it was, first of all, I didn't have any control over like what it was saying. And also, it was talking to me sometimes. It was like, if I'm the voice, then who's listening to the voice? So it was like discovering there is this observer, or there is this thing that recognizes the emotion, recognizes the body, recognizes the thoughts, the voice, the everything. And that's who I am. So who then is that? And that was really tricky, because that's like you're observing the observer, which is difficult because you always move, like the observation point moves, because you have to step outside of it. Slippery. And so I had a lot of slippery work there. And that was then when I sort of had a strong experience of, and I describe it in the book, of just walking along. It was a lake here near my house one day. And it was raining, and I was thinking about, we say it is raining, and I was just considering, like, when we say it is raining, then what is the it that is raining? There is no, like, it's just rain, it's just a process. And that's when it just struck me that maybe me, like that idea of the observer was the same, that there wasn't like an it or a me who was observing. Maybe there was just observation or consciousness itself, like there is rain as a process. And when I hit that, something really opened up, and I just saw that it was so obvious that what I am is just the consciousness of what's going on. And that's just so tricky to put into words, but simply the experience itself. There's no experiencer, there is just the experience of being, of all these things playing out. And as I sort of started investigating that deeper, and through meditative and other sort of inquiry techniques, really looked into that, it's become more and more clear to me that there is no core, there is no me, there is no soul, there is no center. And I really get what the Buddha means, or what like the one of the cores of Buddhist philosophy, which is the idea that there is no center, that there's emptiness, that notion of emptiness. And the problem with this is now we're moving into a terrain which is experience-based. You can't intellectualize it. You can't really explain it because the mind works the way it does. So it needs like objects of thought. And this is a non-object. It's just the vast emptiness of what is. Yeah. It's really tricky.
Going back to what you said earlier about letting go, as I was reading your book and contemplating your discovery, your analysis, it resonated with me in a very deep way, realizing that we are awareness is very freeing and is another way to let go of the baggage.
Yes.
that makes it hard to move, that makes it hard to breathe, that makes it hard to think with clarity. Because in effect, we are holding up all these concepts of a sense of self when they become unnecessary. And that was the big realization for me. So I can say that, if you want to use a metaphor, the day that I read that, I floated around like a balloon. I felt so weightless. I felt light,
Yes. Beautiful.
which is an amazing blessing. And again, I'm not sure, like you said, it's something that needs to be experienced. My personal process that allowed me to recognize the truth in what you said was, when you say that you don't have control over your thoughts, this is something that when you do meditate, you have an awareness of, that I am not the thinker, because like a song gets stuck in your head for 24 hours straight. This thought is not originating from whatever me is. It's something else. So when you said that, it automatically clicked, like, oh, now everything makes sense. And this exploration, just imagining you walking next to your lake, thinking about the it that reigns. Is there a process of asking yourself these questions that can lead to these realizations?
Yes. Like one of the things that I realized when I found the first sort of real experience of this, and it's then been deepened more and more. But obviously that's not the first time someone has said that. It's been said over and over, and you can read a lot of spiritual texts and they'll be sort of pointing to the same thing. And for me, the big shift was the difference between sort of knowing intellectually and then actually experiencing. And so what I can see is that being told this doesn't really do it. It's not enough. It just becomes more knowledge. So what's become sort of my practice or my way with people and what I do for a living is to not speak directly about that, or only do that very little, because as I say, and as it's clear from what I'm saying, it's difficult to really pass on. But to instead look at the illusions that we think we are, which I call stories, like the story of me, the story of Ernest, the story of who I am, and especially looking at the situations where that story somehow is problematic for us, like when we're believing something that's painful or that is getting in the way or that is stopping us. And so this is obviously what that book is really about. It's the process of inquiry, which is to then take these concepts or beliefs and investigate them in a way that dissolves them or undoes them. And as that undoing of more and more of the legs that hold the table of you, as you cut off more and more of those legs, eventually it just collapses. And then you see for yourself who you are. But to be the table, this is not the best metaphor in the world, but to try to point out to the table that it's not a table doesn't work. But by helping the table, take off one leg after another, then eventually the table falls apart and you realize that you're not all that you thought you were, and you step into this not knowing who you are, which is really, it's not a knowing, it's a not knowing, right? So this process of inquiry, of self-inquiry, which really is identifying the beliefs you have about whatever, the world, yourself, usually something that's problematic, and then applying this process of questioning, is it really true, this thing you're believing? Like, I need him to like me is an example of something that we all recognize that we sometimes run into. We're in interacting with somebody or standing on a stage, or and we believe the thought, I need this person to like me. And to question, is that really true that you need this person to like you? It's a belief you have. And is it really true? And what happens when you hold that belief? How do you respond? How do you react? How do you treat the other person? What happens inside you? And then to contemplate, if you didn't believe this thought, I need him to like me, then who would you be? What would it be like to be in this interaction if you were completely free of the need to be liked by this other person? How freeing, how honest, how authentic you would be. And then the process of turning the thought around into, I don't need him to like me, I need me to like him, and I need me to like myself, which is a way of playing with the thought and helping your mind seeing it from different perspectives. What this process does is it collapses the idea, it undoes it, it simply, it disappears into freedom. And suddenly next time you're with somebody, this is a very simplistic example, but still next time you're with somebody, you don't believe that you need them to like you. And so suddenly you're showing up in a whole different way. You can be far more spontaneous and honest. And as you do that, obviously, you get closer and closer to just expressing what is. And it becomes more and more clear that I'm not the guy who needs them to like me. I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy. I'm not that guy. I am just what shows up right here. And eventually, that realization dawns on you that I am presence, or I am love, or, to use some of the big words that make so much sense and probably doesn't if you don't have the experience. But so for me, it's like a process of going around it. Instead of going direct, we go around it, and then the experience comes by itself. And that turns it into a very clear process that you can do, instead of this strange thing where you have to sit on a pillow for 20 years. And if you're lucky, it might happen, And even if that doesn't happen, whatever that is, it still is very helpful, because you undo some stories that are really painful for you. Because it's painful to believe that you need people to like you. It's a really unpleasant place to be.
When you go through the problems directly from the middle can be a jungle, and the middle can be a place where you get stuck forever.
Totally. And our mind plays such tricks with us, because the identification game is the most elaborate game we play, and it seems just to be how mind works, that it wants to identify. And so it'll do it, and then we call it ego, or we can call it what we like, but the tricky hiding, it can go on forever if you try to hit it straight on.
Like you said, it's something that it's hard to talk about, much easier to experience, which is what I loved about your book, is that you have a very actionable way to do inquiry, to go through that process, to better experience how it affects you versus the theoretical.
Yes.
If you ask the right questions in life, that's when you really start to make progress. A very simple question, the simplest question that we could ask when we feel our emotions, when we find ourselves in these stories, is it true? Is there a process that you use to ask yourself these questions, or to have awareness of an assumption that you're making that may or may not be true?
Yeah, the process that I use, and that I use with people and use with myself, and that I advocate, is this process of self-inquiry. And it exists in many different forms. The process of investigating what's really going on inside. And the form that I present in the book is one of the forms of self-inquiry that I really appreciate, which is called the work of Byron Katie, sometimes also known as IBSR, inquiry-based stress reduction. And that's one form, and what characterizes that particular form is that concept of turnarounds, which is unique to this form of inquiry, and is really effective, I find. Now, the thing about inquiry, self-inquiry, this notion of basically asking in a more elaborate way that question: is this true? Is this story I have, or this belief I have, is it really true? What that requires is like access to our full mind, let's call it that, like our frontal lobes, and like a full meditative experience of our nervous system, like our emotional reactions and other stuff. So we need to have it together. Now, when you're in an emotional reaction of some sort, if someone has hurt you or something has happened that really bothers you, then the best methods I find are the simplest ones, like count to 10, go for a walk, take 3 deep breaths, don't get very advanced in that moment, because you have only access to very limited parts of your brain, because you're in a reactive state, which is like a biological thing that helped you survive on the savannah. So that's not the time. But then when you found yourself again, when you're back to an experience of having access to your full self, whatever that means, then it's the time to then sit down and do this process of self-inquiry. So for me, what happens is I have like a practice of when other people's meditate or do yoga, and I like both things, and I do them as well. But I also do this process of self-inquiry. So depending on who you are and your time frame and stuff, like once a day, once a week, whatever, you sit down, and then you have an allotted amount of time, an hour and a half, where you say, now I'm going to do self-inquiry. And then you look at what has been stressful for me, what comes up as stressful, and you investigate those moments, the emotions that come, the beliefs that were there using this process. And what happens then is that as you see through it, some beliefs release, which means that next time you're in a similar situation, you won't be reactive the same way, because you have seen through what was driving you. So what I mean by this is not a tool, or my way of doing it is not to do it when I'm in the situation of reaction. In that situation, I just try to be as kind as I can and get through the situation. And then afterwards, I sit down and I look at it and I go, what was going on? What was triggering me? What was actually happening? And I investigate what's going on. And as I really look deep and ask these questions of to inquire into the situation, I see through the belief, and it lets me go. And so what happens is less and less situations gets me triggered. Like, so today it takes, I experience at least, and I think others would agree, that it takes a lot to trigger me, because it just doesn't happen. And it's not like a doing, it just doesn't happen. And I noticed that I can be in situations where I see someone react, and I'm like, oh yes, of course. That's how I noticed that I'm not reacting anymore. It just doesn't happen. And it's so natural that I don't even notice that it's not happening unless I'm confronted with either a memory of how I used to be or someone else.
So what is the most, or one of the most powerful examples of using inquiry in your own life?
Wow. Yeah, no, I think one of the most profound shifts that I've experienced is, I think very early on in life, I experienced like in my experience, almost everyone does during childhood, that they're not enough. I'm not good enough the way I am. And I need to compensate for that. And people have many different ways of doing that. And how I compensated was, I must make myself perfect. I will now make myself perfect. It wasn't like a conscious decision, but it was definitely the thing that happened. So my life from pretty early on became a striving to be what my parents expected of me, and what my peers and what my teachers expected. So to perfect myself. Now, the challenge or the problem for me was, I was actually pretty good at that, where others may fall short in the process. I was so unfortunate that I actually had the skill set to become pretty good. So I excelled in a lot of areas, and including human interactions, at the price of becoming what's the English word?
By the way, I love that you said the unfortunate.
Yeah. That's really what it was, because I believed I could make it. Like, that's the problem, right? I actually had an idea that I had a chance of making it.
Yeah,
so
you didn't have the life experience smacking some truth into you.
Yeah. So I was very good at university, and I was very early. I was teaching, and I was doing this, and I was writing a book. I was doing very well. So I managed to build this persona of having it together. Let's call it that. But obviously, what that does is it does create a distance to life. The experience was, I couldn't truly share myself. I'm loved for what I'm capable of, not for who I am. I am fundamentally not lovable as I am, but for what I do, right? This is a classic bind that we land in. And so I was doing work on that, coming from different aspects. I was sort of becoming aware that this was it, but I was so scared of letting go of this perfect me, and basically because my thought was people would reject the real me if I let it out. So, like, in practice, some of the things that it meant was that in my early relationships to girls, I was taking it as far as I was comfortable to. But for instance, getting very intimate was scary because I couldn't control. I didn't have experience enough, and I couldn't keep it. I couldn't be a cool lover from the first time I made love to someone, for instance.
You were lacking vulnerability.
It's a very good way of putting it. Also, yeah, unwilling to be vulnerable, to step into that place because maybe I couldn't keep it together. So one of the biggest shifts was me working that, and I remember it very clearly, a retreat in Ireland where I was really working through that, and I was getting a lot of positive response from my surroundings, and it became sort of a safe place where I could sort of begin to step out. And it was a combo of several things, but two profound incidents I remember one thing was a guy came up to me and said, just very honestly, he said, there's something about you having it so together that makes me not want to approach you. And I realized that I was scaring people away, that my project had actually always been to scare people away by having it so together that they wouldn't want to approach me, so I wouldn't be put in that vulnerable position. It was like a tactic. And I saw that very clearly. And so it was combined with an exercise of standing up and sharing, like, what are you most ashamed of? And so I stood up in this group of people and I shared that I was ashamed of being this controlled person and not allowing myself to be vulnerable. And that sort of released to a new level where all these beliefs became clear to me. I could sort of access them. And then through a process of working through these beliefs, this thing shifted into, not having it together is the coolest thing in the world. Like, let's see what happens. Why would I want to have it together? And obviously, speaking of presence, this control would be keeping me away from the last bit of stepping into presence, because I had to premeditate or the radar had to be on in terms of what's going to happen in a minute. Can I handle it? Or should I begin controlling the situation now? And so it was a release into surrendering, basically, to let's see what happens. And if maybe I'll mess it up and I'll probably be okay even if I do that. And of course, the good thing is, as I started doing that, I began to experience I was loved even when I messed up. When I showed up as me, actually, people started saying to me, I have many good friends and still, many were responding with, it's so nice that you started sharing more about yourself. It's so nice that you're showing your vulnerability. So it was clear people actually liked me more for stepping down from my pedestal, where my thought had been, I have to be out there to be liked, So I would say that's one of the most profound sort of overall processes and shifts in my life story that's come through this work. And then there's been like hundreds of smaller and bigger, minor shifts that has sort of more and more that has shedded more and more of these personal, well, also shredded, but shedded more and more of these personal hangs that a personality is just a bunch of beliefs that sort of creates this solid that you run into when you're in front of somebody. And the more these things go away, the more spacious the meeting with another person becomes. It's just, you're welcome as you are, and there's acceptance, and there's love, and there's freedom. And I use the word again. I do find that what happens as we undo or release or dissolve these fixed points is that what comes through is love. It's the best word I have for it. It's just this experience of everything is okay the way it is, and I love you. And these days, I fall in love with people all the time. I walk into a shop and I just fall in love with the guy behind the counter or the woman who's handing out the groceries, or it's just an amazing moment of wow, and then move on, and that is past, and then something new comes. That's my inner life anyway.
I think that love that you speak about for other people directly comes from the vulnerability that you allow yourself to feel. And so for people listening out there, feel free to confront your capabilities of being vulnerable because they open a whole new world. If you love someone, Ernest, if you go to the store, right, and you love the man behind the counter who is serving you, you open yourself up to, you know, his feelings about you, right? Like it's a vulnerable state of being, and you only get there by allowing yourself to be vulnerable. I'm having issues formulating my thoughts on this. I can sort of clearly see the pictures in the movie going in my head, but there are people that seem to have everything together, that are unapproachable, that create, and when especially myself, right? Because I seek out these types of people to interact with them for my show specifically. And what I find amazing about all of them is that when I'm performing my initial outreach, I am scared. I'm nervous about approaching them because they do seem to have it all together. And then through our conversations, I've immediately become disarmed. And that's because I see, like, you know, there's the projected self, there's the projected me of my website and all the things that I write that are perfectly formulated and edited to the millionth degree. And people look at that and say, oh, that's Brad, but that's not really Brad. That's the projection that I put out there.
Yes. Yeah, that's beautiful. This came up for me that what's interesting about vulnerability and the transparency that goes with it, because that's also an important aspect of making yourself visible in your weakness or whatever it is that it can feel so dangerous and vulnerable, in the sense hurtable, but it truly is the most invincible or safe space to be in, because when you are hiding nothing, there's nothing that can be
discovered.
Be uncovered in an unpleasant way, or you don't have anything to defend. Basically, it's like a very defenseless state. But that defenselessness is the strongest position of any. It's like Lao Tzu says that, you know, whether you're moving up the ladder or down the ladder, your position is shaky. You know, the only safe place is by standing on the ground, and by that, what I hear is like you're trying to climb the social ladder or the ladder of perfection or whatever, and you're shaky because there's something to defend all the time, than an image or a projected me or my success or whatever. When you're just willing to constantly expose your stupidity, your ignorance, your lack of ability, then no one can, you know, it's just, yeah, that's me. It's true. You know, yeah, I fucked up. That's true. I'm an idiot. That's true. But in that, there's something so disarming and so lovable and so kind that allows other people to also relax in your company.
Because it's how we all feel, I think.
Yeah. I can just be me with you because you are you with you. You know, you're you with me. I usually, or I sometimes use the example or the metaphor of having your tie tied so tightly that you can hardly breathe, right? Like, because I work a lot with business, and sometimes I come out to meetings where with like high level executives and others, and some, not all, but sometimes it happens that there is this atmosphere in the room of this, exactly this projected perfection of these sharp suits and these tight ties and saying everything right. And it can be hard to breathe in that environment until we take it down a notch and just, you know, we are all just family men who go home and mess up. You know, let's not make us more than we are. And that's when, you know, the heart opens. Yeah.
That's real value. So let's segue. I want to ask you, because I see you as this person who sits with questions and finds answers to questions that otherwise may just be discounted, or maybe it's a question that's asked and the answer is too hard to figure out, so we move on from the question. What's a question that you're thinking about a lot lately?
Well, is the universe friendly? For me, that's really a core question at the moment. For me, it feels like a really fundamental question. Is this a friendly universe or not? Because if the universe is friendly, and by that I mean, does it support me completely? Then I can relax, because then then I don't have to do anything. Then everything's okay. Even when something doesn't work, it will be because something better is at work, right? There's an intelligence or whatever we call it, and it's not because I'm religious in any sort of classic sense, but there's something at work. What I'm considering is this: like if nature there is this perfection going on in nature. And I love watching these nature documentaries, like, because it's just the intricate nuances of how nature works. Of one day a year, this shark swims from Australia to Southern America, and it hits it just the day the shrill, or whatever they're called, come up from the Antarctica, and then it can eat, and then it goes back, and there are these bats that go up. They're just, the connections are unbelievable. So, and I would call that intelligence, and it doesn't mean that there's a consciousness in any godlike sense, but it's an intelligent working of things that fit in. And we human beings, me as a human being, I am part, like, I've come out of that same nature where everything fits in so well. Like, as I said, it's a windy day, and it's windy in the autumn, and that all the leaves come off because there's so much. It's every intricate thing, right? And I've come out of that, but for some reason we humans tend to think that we are separate. Like, that there is this story of. And I think it's especially in the West and very based on sort of the Christian idea of this world being created as a testing ground for us human beings to be tested whether we go up or down eventually. And so it's separate from us. God created us separate from the universe in the Christian myth. But if we see ourselves as part of it and coming out of nature and out of this universe, then why would that intelligent structure that holds everything, why would we think that doesn't also hold my life? That I can't lean into a friendly universe where everything fits together. So it's really, another way of formulating the question is, am I part of this world or not? Am I an expression of nature or not? And if I am, then I can trust my nature, because it's a very, very intelligent thing. It's like unbelievably intelligent. So instead of having to control nature with my consciousness and my decision power and my willpower, I can perhaps trust that when it doesn't feel right to do something, for some reason, there could be an intelligence, an unconscious intelligence informing me that now is not the time. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little carried away. But the question is, like, is the universe friendly? Can I trust the universe? Can I trust my own nature? Can I lean back into what feels right, and will it eventually lead me to a good place, even though sometimes it looks like, or it has to take me through a process that can look dangerous. I'm sorry, I stopped because what came up for me was this Rumi poem that I really also enjoy at the moment. Let me recite it. It's short. It goes like this: love is not a subtle argument. The door there is devastation. The birds make great sky circles of their freedom. How do they do it? They fall, and falling, they're given wings. And I'll just repeat it. Love is not a subtle argument. The door there is devastation. The birds make great sky circles of their freedom. How do they do it? They fall, and falling, they're given wings.
So through the learning is the fruit?
Well, I find
what
several
does it mean
things
to
in
you?
that. Yeah, to me, there is the aspect of the door to love is devastation. It's a very powerful thing to say. We have this notion of love as this candy floss, or I don't know if we have it, but there exists this idea of love as this candy floss thing of straw eating lions and all of us just living together in harmony. But love, the door to that place is devastation, like the personality or whatever, the ego that we just spoke about has to be shedded and shredded, and that can be a painful process sometimes. So to really get to that point, there is devastation. And as part of that, there is that falling, like how does the birds get the wings to make their great sky circles of freedom by falling. It's so dangerous to stand on that ledge and just jump, and you don't know whether you'll have wings or not. Like, imagine the bird that jumps out of the nest the first time. Its whole life has just been in that nest, and it's been fed, and it's been doing stuff. And some instinct pushes it to go out, but it has never flown before, right? So it just falls. It must be terrifying. And then, to its surprise, suddenly it flies. But it requires that act of falling, of giving up, of surrender to, in this case, I would say, the friendly universe. And until you do, you can't in advance like check out, is it friendly? I'm only going to go into the water if the water is the right temperature and there are no sharks in there. You have to jump in and see if you'll float. To mix 15 different metaphors here.
It's beautiful. I love it. The antelopes that run in Africa, they've never been eaten by a cheetah. And yet when they see one, they run. That is natural instinct taking place. And I totally get what you're saying. Malcolm Gladwell expresses these snap decisions that we make as blinks. Basically the distillation of a bunch of knowledge that we have learned over time that give us this boom and intuition to do X, Y, or Z in this situation, or we feel X, Y, or Z in a specific situation. And I think what you're proposing is deeper than that, in that it's nothing about us. It's not about the knowledge we have gained. And yeah, I can see why you would be spending a lot of time on that specific question.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that, when I look back, and I think, try this as a listener out there, like from this moment, look back at your life and look at all the things that have happened, even the most horrible moments. If you look at them deeply, I'm sure that you too will find that they were all for something, that they have brought you to this moment. And that this moment, and for some, this moment can feel unpleasant, but if you really look into it, even now you are held. It's jumping around a little bit, but the present moment is always safe. It's in our story about future that we get scared. So when I check out, is the universe friendly? Can I trust the universe? I have no proof in my past story that I can't. And yet I project this fear of what might happen in the future. And it's only a story in my head that something horrible might happen if I don't have, say, enough money, or, these people don't like me, or my business collapses, or, but we always get through to the other side. It's the most surprising thing.
I had another realization in reading your book that gave me a jolt of energy, made me feel great. And it was this realization about us talking about the present and how the past is a simulation, the future is a simulation, how even now I'm talking to you in my office and my living room is on the other side of the wall. And I imagine my cat sitting in their cat tree. They may or they may not be. It is a simulation, and human beings are very good at making these simulations, and we do it with limited awareness that we are doing it. We just do it naturally.
Yes.
The thought that I had that was very freeing and exciting was that these simulations take mental energy. They exhaust mental resources when we do them thousands of times a day. And the brain itself expends 25% of our energy, despite being only about 3% of our body weight. So it is a massive consumer of energy. So when we live in the present and we allow ourselves to have awareness of the simulations and limit those simulations, does that give us more energy? Does it give us more space to live our lives and take the actions that we need to take without feeling tired?
Well, for sure. I mean, there's an obvious, almost scientific calculation that would support that. Of course, it takes energy to create and uphold these simulations. Now the construction of the simulations aren't the most energy consuming aspect, because it's like it runs on clean energy. It's like green energy compared to the emotions that come with the simulations. That's where the real hard work is. If your simulations are negative, say negative simulations about the past or fears about the future, and you uphold them, and that's the world you're living in, like replaying something unpleasant that happened to you earlier, or imagining something unpleasant that's going to happen tomorrow, then your body will constantly, as I also explained in the book, respond to whatever is going on in your simulator. So your emotional state is an effect of what you're simulating. And negative emotions, which is basically just getting the body ready to respond. Like, again, we're back to just evolutionary stuff. We're out in the savannah and there's a lion. And so our body gets in this high alert state. And that's very energy consuming. And so every time you simulate a lion, quote unquote, which is like any scary moment or like a stressful event or whatever, either future or past, your body will immediately respond with getting prepared to fight or run, right? Or freeze. And so that's where there's a lot of energy lost. Not just the simulation of the unpleasant past, say, but the emotional responses to the unpleasant past. And so step one is, as you release the unpleasant stuff, you use less and less energy on not just upholding that, but also reacting to that. And then the next step is that even the positive things, they sort of just slide away and you just become present here now. And there's less and less to consider, because life will show me what to do next. It's so simple. Like, I don't have to plan this elaborate thing. It'll show itself. It'll show itself through me. Oh, there's the dog. Oh, it's hungry. I go prepare the food. I give the food to the dog. The phone rings. I answer. Can you come for this job? Yes, I can. Okay. See you on Monday. It just happens as you surrender to the present moment and let go of that whole controlling thing. Yeah.
There's a quote, fairly or unfairly, attributed to Mark Twain, who said that he's experienced many tragedies in his life, and some of them actually happened. I think that encapsulates what you're saying about
perfectly
the emotion.
And those tragedies are very energy consuming, all those that he has experienced, even if they never happened.
Let's move to the lightning round, I guess, part of the conversation. I don't know how lightning it will be.
There is such a thing. Yeah.
Well, basically the more pre-prepared questions that I have versus, an exploration of which.
Good. And would you like me to answer quickly? Is that part of the lightning element?
No.
Okay.
There's actually no lightning element to the lightning round.
Good. But we'll move to the lightning round. I like that it has a name, and it's a good name. It's a really good name. Let's move to the lightning round and see some slow light move.
I'm only the 2 millionth person that's used the term. So
yes.
What's something related to cognitive performance that you observe people wasting a lot of time on that doesn't give them much in the way of results?
Well, worry, I would say, is like a key thing, right? Worrying about what will happen and having to control what will happen. Like exactly your Mark Twain quote, which exists in other versions, like and from other people, but it would be, instead of I've had many tragedies, it's like I've had many problems in my life and most of them never happened. So spending all that energy on all these problems and worrying about them, and then they turn out to be nothing, I would say. That's something that costs a lot of energy, and which just, when you start realizing that it's just simulation and you simply don't know, it's like you're at the train station, the train is late, you'll be late for your meeting, and immediately this whole movie comes of, I'll be late to the meeting, I won't get that gig or whatever, or if you have a job, I'll be fired, and you end up in the gutter in your story. You're like, now I'm a drug addict or like a prostitute or something, just because my train is late. It's just how quickly we develop this story, and that's so consuming compared to just acknowledging the train is late and let's see what that's good for. Like maybe it's the best thing in the world that I'm late. Maybe it allows someone else to step in and do the thing I was supposed to do, and they'll do it better, and everything will be perfect. I mean, but if we are conditioned to, and I'm talking from nature, to focus on the negative because we want to survive, so we want to avoid the negative. So the stories we create about the future will always be like, or will usually be negative based on some event like the late train, and we don't go to the positive.
To build on that with a very concrete story, for me, it is having this conversation with you. This is an activity that I know people will listen to and spend their time and energy on. So there is this pressure to perform at a high level. And because of that pressure to ask good questions that give value to the listener, I have found myself having awareness of simulating this conversation with you. I've probably had this conversation already, 1,000 times in my mind, and trying to control the way it goes and trying to make sure that I know everything I need to know. And that mental energy was, quite frankly, a waste of time. So that's a very concrete.
And are you sure it's wasted? It hasn't helped you at any point in this conversation that you've simulated it?
Okay, well, at some point, the returns are diminishing. Maybe the first few times it is very useful and very useful to the flow of the conversation. But the 100th time, it is not very useful.
That's clear. Yeah. Okay. There is this thing I like to quote, which goes like this: over-prepared, under-rehearsed. That's like a very lovely state to be in. So over-prepared in this case would be read the book, look at my website, listen to some of my podcasts, whatever. That's over-prepared. But under-rehearsed, like don't do it 100 times in your head, because that's only, as you say, that'll diminish I love that. So that's a very lovely example. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ernest, what does your typical morning routine look like?
I have the privilege of a very varied life. So I do different things, different things almost every day. If I get to have it my way, my morning routine is I wake up, at some pleasant hour that is by myself and not by the alarm clock. And then I have like this morning set of morning exercises that I do, which is basically a form of yoga thing that I go through. And then I begin the day, and it can really be 100 different things. So in the categories of talking to clients, going out to do some sort of a workshop or never mind what I do, basically. Yeah. You're asking about my morning routine. I hear that.
I think what's most necessary are the actionable things that the audience could apply to their own life.
Right. Thank you. So there's not the action of centering myself through this physical process of exercising for about half an hour, doing a series of yoga and other like physical exercises really balances me, gets my body ready, gets my mind focused, and then sets me off into the day. And for me, it needs that physical aspect in the morning. I'm not a morning meditator. That's not. When I've slept, now it's about waking up the body. The mind is rested. I don't need to meditate. I need the body to start. But I love the yogic thing with the deep breathing and the slow movement, because that also centers the mind. But it needs that physical aspect.
Love that.
Thank you.
Love that. Do you have any books that you reread every few years? And if so, which ones?
Yes, I do. Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha. I love that one. That really resonates with me. And then Stephen Mitchell's translation of the Tao Te Ching, also a very powerful thing. And then I keep returning to Rumi and his poetry. I think one of the books I've read, I've read it many times, is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, if you know that one, which is in like a very different genre, but I love returning to that.
Do you still read the fantasy books?
Yes, when I do, and these days it's more I do like audiobooks. But when I do read that, yeah, they are like the easy reads that I like. Yeah. Sometimes I read literature, but that feels more like an effort or like a doing.
Mm-hmm.
It takes mental energy to read like good, well written, high level literature without without diminishing the fantasy stuff. But it's more like watching a James Bond movie
It's work,
compared to
right? So imagine yourself as a 20-year-old man again, and imagine that that carbon copy of yourself is listening to this interview. What wisdom would you like to impart on him or her?
Wow, that's a great question. It's something to do with what we talked about earlier, that the way the way to the heart is being vulnerable. Just allowing yourself to be seen. Despite all the fears, it always yields the best result. To be transparent. Presence. The present moment is the key, or is the place, let's say, and the door there is vulnerability or transparency. Just letting it fall, letting it drop, give up and just be. Yeah.
Love that. If you could wave a magic wand and solve one problem in the world, what would it be?
My instinctual reaction really is I wouldn't. I've done too much, of this inquiry where I've seen how I'm the last person to play God because it's a mess. So I wouldn't. I really do trust that even if it looks bleak at times, the whole thing is as it should be. The way things are exactly the way they should be. So I wouldn't, both because I don't think anything should be changed as such, and because I certainly don't want the responsibility of that decision. So I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't waive it. Which is interesting. I hadn't known that until you asked, but that really is my answer. Yeah.
That's an amazing answer. I love it. What is a project that you're currently working on that's near and dear to your heart?
Well, you hit me right after I've published the book, which has really been the main project for intensely for some months. And so that's been very near, and sort of bringing that the rest of the way out and sharing that with the world is very near and dear. But as you ask me, there's something going on for me personally, which is I'm noticing, and it's so weird. It's coming out of this whole process with the book that I'm just chilling so much these days. There are things where I say to myself, okay, today I'm going to do this thing. And it just doesn't happen. People call me and I take care of business and all of that, but I'm just not like developing things. So I'm in a process of just really exhaling and allowing that to happen is really important. And I can see thoughts that come up and say, you need to do this, or you need to, harvest on this book, or there are all these things that come up, and there's just such a clear no in me that even if I wanted to, I can't. So I'm sort of trying to turn that into a project. I party, I go to concerts, I do stuff, just hang out. My wife and I are having the most amazing time. And that really is near and dear to my heart at the moment, but it's probably not the kind of project you were asking for.
Your answers in these questions are incredible. They're making me feel like such joy just really thinking about. It's a counterintuitive answer to the question that, again, I feel like makes so much sense, that we need rest and we need rejuvenation and we need to unwind, especially after you've just put out there a major project. So the project that you're working on is relaxing, calming down. And that's incredible to me. I think it gives people permission to relax, to calm down. And it's a very important thing when people understand that, no, maybe they don't have to wake up and check off the first 10 items on their list in order to feel like an accomplished person. Maybe if their spirit, their mind, their body is telling them no, they just should work on becoming rejuvenated. And so this question, I'll preface it by saying that it's about humanity or the world and not as an introspection. Have you ever strongly believed something only to reverse course later on? And if so, what led to that change of belief?
Well, I've believed, it's not about introspection. These things are very, like, I see the world as a projection, or my perspective on the world as a projection of my mind. So they connect very much, like what's inside and what's outside. But the first thing that sort of came up for me was Donald Trump, whom I strongly believed should not become president of the United States. And this may be something you need to cut out. I know this is touching on something very sensitive. And when he did, I really felt that was something for me to work on, because I strongly disagree with some of what I notice around him. And then I worked on it, did this process, and now I see it differently. And honestly, I feel with him, and I feel very sorry for the position he's in. It can't be easy to be him in that office. That's the first thing that came up. I don't know if that's very relevant. If I look back in time, further back, I would say we are back in that whole sort of spiritual, okay. I strongly believed that I needed to save people, that I needed to save the world, improve the world. I was doing these earth healing meditation ceremonies of imagining that I was sending love to the world, and back in the young years. And today I have completely realized that the world is in here, in my mind, and that's all there is to it. And the only one that needs healing is this mind. That the world out there is just fine. So I've reversed my direction on that very clearly. And
another freeing letting go of baggage that.
For sure, yeah. The world is my responsibility. I carry it on my shoulders. Only my world is my responsibility. It's the only world that exists. Yeah.
Which is not to say that you don't have compassion when confronted with situations you have energy.
On the contrary. On the contrary. I find that I fearlessly throw myself into one thing after the other out of compassion, for sure. Yeah.
By freeing yourself up, you have much more space to throw yourselves into these things.
Yeah, and I would even say I do it in a much better way. I would say there is a respect for people's ability to solve their own problems. So I don't throw myself in there and try to fix their business, but I'm available with an offer. Would you like some support? And then I leave it to them whether they want the support or not. And if they want it, I'm happy to do what I can if it feels right for me. Yeah. Yeah.
If you could share one truth with the world, and I guess truth is a very strong word, what would that truth be?
That there is only this present moment, and everything else is a simulation in your mind.
All right, my friend. I loved having this conversation. I love you as a human being. Thank you so very much for coming on. Final question is, where can my audience find you on the World Wide Web?
www.theartofbeinghuman.com.
Thank you, sir. Have a great rest of your day, and can't wait to share this with the world.
Thanks a lot, Brad. Thank you for some very, very interesting questions along the way. It's really worked for me. Thanks a lot.
Next time on the Process Podcast, I have with me television personality and author of Believe Bigger, Discover the Path to Your Life Purpose, Marshawn Evans Daniels.
The powerful really thing about journaling is that you can look at snapshots in different seasons of your life and you can see this common theme and pattern. I ended up getting married to an amazing man. A lot of people asked him, did you ask for forgiveness for what you did? And he's like, I'm not the guy. I'm not the guy who cheated on her. I'm not that guy. I'm the happy ending guy. Get to chapter 16. But I was kind of wrestling one day with the sense of direction. He said, pick up any journal that you have over the last 10 years. And I promise you're going to see a common pattern. I'm like, no, you're not. And I pick it up. He said, okay, now pick up another one. Open it up to any page. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so true. Like our lives really are fairly unpredictably predictable when you look at the common pattern that goes throughout. And so I read my own writings because they become fresh teachings and you always open up to what you need to hear in that moment, as opposed to going to something new. What if we mastered what we were already received and what we were already working on?
Don't forget to subscribe to the Process Podcast or head to mentallyinvincible.com and join my email newsletter, because this is a conversation you don't want to miss.